Before we get started, I want to encourage you to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so that you don't miss any of the content that is released by GoCollect. And if you're interested, head over to Regie Collects here on YouTube. Regie here, your friendly neighborhood bodybuilder and comic book collector and the host of the GoCollect recap video. And I want to welcome you to another episode. In this episode, we are going to spend some time looking at some blog posts that have been posted to the GoCollect website. These blog posts are a little different from many of the posts that we've been talking about over the last few weeks and months, in that each one of these blog posts goes sort of deep. They provide you with some detailed information that may be of value to you as a speculator or investor in comics. The very first blog post that I want to talk about is one that was essentially suggested by one of you. And Norman heard the call and put together a really solid post that spends some time talking about a term that we use in these videos every single week. And it's really around the returns that are seen with certain comics. And you'll hear me talk about, a positive return or a negative return at this grade or that grade. And that's just how we've referenced it in the various blog posts and in the videos. And someone said, well, what do you mean by returns? Norman does a really good job of breaking it down for you. And at the end of the day, what he's basically saying is that versus the previous sale, the comic's value has either been positive or negative. And so the return is either positive or negative. If you do some simple math, you can actually calculate from the percent and from that last sales price what the previous price was and also what the absolute dollar increase or decrease actually was for that comic. But as Norman points out, GoCollect prefers to use percentages versus absolute numbers. But as I mentioned, some simple math can actually get there if you want to see both the percent and the absolute increase or decrease for a particular comic. In addition to talking about the calculations and the rationale behind why GoCollect uses percentages, Norman points out some other features and functionality that you may want to check out. You definitely want to check out this blog post. The link to it is down in the description. So what would you say if I told you that you could buy Amazing Fantasy for $15 or Action Comics for $300 or Incredible Hulk #1 for about $14? What would you say? The truth of the matter is that back in the 70s, those were the exact prices of every single one of the books that I just mentioned to you. Now, if we could go back in time, I think that every single one of us would have spent the $15, the $14, and the $300 several times over in order to buy these fantastic books. And in this next blog post, the blogger essentially poses the same type of question, if you will, as to whether there are books now that you could buy for that same type of chump change, and ask the question as to whether you should be investing in these keys for the future as a hedge against inflation. The blogger does a really good job of defining a couple of terms like inflation and making an argument as to why comics are not like antique furniture, which is a collectible area that has dropped dramatically over the last 20 years. If anything that I've spoken about in the last couple of minutes is of interest to you, if you want to know how comics essentially serve as a piggy bank for the future, you definitely want to take a look at this blog post. It is honestly worth the read. I think that you'll walk away from this post a little bit more informed. Maybe it confirms some things that you already knew or assumed. Take the time, check it out. The link down in the description. So earlier in this episode, I spent a couple of moments talking about a blog post that Norman had written that essentially looks at the rate of return associated with comics and what that really means. This next blog post, to some degree or another, essentially picks up where that article left off, in the sense that the blogger spends some time talking about a couple of modern comics that have essentially seen drops in their rates of return across almost all, if not all, grades for these particular books. And that doesn't mean that these aren't books that you should pick up. It doesn't mean that these are books that you want to get rid of. It doesn't mean that these are books that you should stay away from. But the blogger basically makes the argument that you should at least be aware of what is happening with these books. And if you have them, if you're thinking about picking them up, maybe now is a good time. Maybe these are the types of books that you'll end up buying and holding for the next 5 to 10 years. The blogger specifically talks about 3 hot books, the first of which is Amazing Spider-Man 361. And this book at a 9.6 essentially has a negative return of about 6.5%. Its last sale was $230, and there are 4,200 copies of this particular book on the CGC census. Next up is Spawn 1, and this book has a negative return at a 9.6 of 17.1%. The 9.8, however, is selling for around $125 and has a positive return at 4.5%, with about 8,200 on the census. And in comparison, there is Ultimate Fallout number 4, which is... It honestly has a positive return at 1 grade, and all other grades have declined. The 9.8 is selling for just about $1,100 with around 2,051 copies on the CGC census. This book has, at a 9.8, a 3.5% rate of return. And as mentioned, at almost all other grades, this book has basically had a decline. And as I said, that doesn't mean that these are books that you want to stay away from. These books potentially could have a rebound. They could potentially go up in value, though those rates of return could turn positive. If certain news comes out and it is positive, it could have a dramatic impact on these books. But by and large, these are also potentially future blue chip type of books, depending upon which copy you have and which grade you have. But again, I definitely want to encourage you to take a look at this blog post, the link to it down in the description. Next up is a fantastic blog post that is essentially an interview with Marc Nathan, who is the owner-operator of the Baltimore Comic-Con. I have heard nothing but good things about this con. I know several people that travel to this con every single year because they absolutely love the quality of this show, the vendors that show up. And one of the big questions is what is going to happen with the Baltimore Comic-Con this year. So if you've ever thought about going to New York Comic-Con, if you have hope that a con will actually happen this year, this is the blog post you want to check out. So the Snyder Cut continues to make waves out there in the comic universe, or the ocean, if you will. A teaser clip from Snyder's Cut has actually taken a dollar book to some new heights, if you will. Book that was selling for $1 not that long ago is now selling for between $10 to $15. And maybe you even have this book in your bins. More than likely, it's probably in the back of the bin like a red-headed stepchild. But this is potentially a book that you want to dig out. And if you haven't put it in the bag and board, you might want to do just that. And if you don't have this book in your collection, you may want to hit up those dollar bins and see if you can snag a copy of Action Comics issue number 689. And this is actually the first appearance of Superman in his black costume. Now, what's a little different about this black costume, unlike some other black costumes, is that this doesn't necessarily mean that Superman is bad. It doesn't mean that he's evil. simply means that he needs a little recovery. And so his recovery suit is a suit that essentially allows him to absorb more of the sun's rays, thus energizing himself and returning him back to health. And so issue 689 of Action Comics was a comic that was released after Superman had returned from death, and so therefore he was wearing his black costume because he needed some recovery. So if you have any interest in this issue, you may want to check this blog post out. It is an awesome read. Oh, I should also mention that the blogger thinks that this book could potentially get up to about $20 to $30. So if you needed a little bit more motivation to hit up those dollar bins, there you go. So last week we spoke a little bit about Hulu. This week we are going to talk about Netflix and the impact that Netflix is actually having on Transformers issue number 1. So recently there was a reboot of the Transformers title. Netflix rolled out a new series that people are absolutely enjoying, and then there's also 2 movies rumored to be in the works for Transformers. And so there is a resurgence in interest in this particular book. Now, if we go back in time, we could have potentially purchased Transformers issue number 1 in 2018 at a 9.8 for about $400. A year later, that book jumped up to around $600. And now that same book at a 9.8 is averaging $730. And the most recent sales actually rung in at about $850 and $870. That is a lot of money for Transformers 1. It is honestly, it's a fantastic comic, don't get me wrong, and I have a special place in my heart for Transformers, but that is some serious money for this particular book. So again, if you haven't dug in your bins recently, you may want to go digging to see if you can identify some of these books. But I would definitely encourage you to check out this blog post if you have an opportunity to do so. Transformers are hot right now, and I'm honestly about to go in the other room here and watch this Netflix series because clearly there is some magic being made. So there you have it. We have reached the end of another episode. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this video, and if you enjoyed it, I want to encourage you to leave a comment behind, hit the thumbs up button. It's good for the Google YouTube algorithm. And I definitely want to encourage you to come back next week when we get to do this all over again.